Welcome to this deep dive. We're tackling a conflict that you might not be hearing about every day, but one with incredibly high stakes. Today, we're diving into the struggle for peace in Oromia, Ethiopia. And we're going beyond the surface, digging into reports and analysis, trying to understand why peace remains so elusive in this, well, frankly, historically significant region.
Yeah, you're right. This is far from a localized issue. We're talking about Oromia, the most populous region in Ethiopia. So the ripple effects of this conflict, they're felt far and wide.
So let's set the stage a bit. Our sources are focused on these stalled peace talks between the Ethiopian government and the OLA, the Oromo Liberation Army. But this isn't just some recent flare-up, is it?
Not at all. I think to really grasp the complexities here, we need back up a bit. The Oromo people, they have a long history in Ethiopia, and their call for rights, for autonomy, has been going on for decades, even under different regimes.
Okay, so the OLA, they're front and center in the sources we've been looking at, but it sounds like they're part of a much bigger picture here. So who are they and what are they fighting for exactly?
Right, so the OLA, they actually started as the armed wing of the Oromo Liberation Front, or OLF for short. So picture a political party with a history spanning over half a century, consistently pushing for the rights of the Oromo people. Now, the OLA and OLF, they're separate entities now, but those core goals, they haven't changed for the OLA. It's still about securing rights and autonomy for the Oromo people.
And when we say, rights and autonomy, what are we actually talking about? Like, what are the core issues that have been driving this conflict for so long?
Well, it's this really complex web of grievances. You've got political grievances, economic ones, cultural ones,
Yeah.
all intertwined. But one major point of contention has always been language. Imagine being denied the right to learn in your own language, to use it freely in your own homeland. The Oromo people, they faced that for years.
And I'm guessing control over their own resources also factors into this.
Absolutely. Oromia, it's a region rich in resources, but the Oromo people haven't always benefited equally from that wealth. And that feeling, that sense of being exploited, of not having control over your own destiny, it's a powerful driver in any conflict. And it goes beyond just economics, too. Imagine this. A capital city built on what you consider your ancestral land, but your people's historical and cultural connection to that city is barely acknowledged, if at all. We're talking about Addis Ababa, of course, Ethiopia's capital. It's considered by the Oromo people to be central to their heritage, yet that significance, it's not fully recognized, and it just adds another layer to this whole struggle.
Yeah, it's layer upon layer here, these long-standing grievances, this desire for self-determination. So with all that in mind, were there any attempts, any at all, to maybe try to bridge these divides? I mean, our sources mentioned something about a broken agreement back in 2018.
Right, 2018, that was a big year. There's an agreement between the government and the OLF, and it was, at least on paper, supposed to bring them in from the cold, let them participate in the political process. They've been in exile for years, so this seemed like a real opportunity.
Okay, so what happened? It fell apart, obviously, but why?
Well, promises were made, but in the end, the agreement unraveled. And this is where things get, well, even more complicated, because it led to this resurgence of violence, and the OLA, their role, it became even more pronounced, which, I hate to say it, but it's almost a recurring pattern you see in these types of conflicts, right? This glimmer of hope, then dashed expectations, and ultimately it just deepens the distrust and fuels further violence.
And that leads us right to these peace talks, the most recent ones that happened just last year, 2023, that our sources say also failed. Was there any sense that this time it might actually be different?
In the beginning, there was this sense of cautious optimism, I guess you could say, because you had these high-ranking OLA commanders, and they were actually at the table in Tanzania for these talks. So that at least signaled some willingness to engage in dialogue, and there were even reports of progress on some of those core political issues we were talking about earlier.
So what happened? I mean, after decades of this conflict, why couldn't they make it stick? What was the sticking point?
Power sharing, that's where the talks ultimately hit a wall.
Yeah.
It's one thing to agree in principle, but actually hammering out the details of how you divide power within the existing structure, or even create a new one, it gets really, really complicated. You're talking about deeply entrenched positions, years, decades of historical baggage, and let's be real, a very real fear of what happens if you're the one who relinquishes control. It's incredibly delicate.
So yeah, even with those glimmers of hope, that question, who really holds the reins, that remain the biggest hurdle. And meanwhile, you have the people of Oromia caught in the middle of this impasse.
And we're talking a staggering human cost. I mean, The picture our sources paint, it's a full-blown humanitarian crisis unfolding, especially in the western and southern parts of Oromia.
And this is where I think we have to shift gears a bit from the political complexities to the very real human impact.
Hmm.
Can you give us a sense of what's actually happening on the ground? What are people experiencing because of this conflict?
Imagine this. Your home is no longer safe. There's this constant threat of violence, and you're forced to flee. You leave everything behind.
Yeah.
Your belongings, your livelihood, your sense of security, everything. And we're not talking about a handful of people. It's hundreds of thousands, potentially millions, displaced by this conflict.
And if that weren't enough, our sources point out that the conflict creates this vicious cycle when it comes to basic needs like food and water.
Right, because the instability makes it incredibly risky, if not impossible, for aid organizations to operate. So delivering essential goods, services, it becomes incredibly difficult. So now you have a population not only dealing with the trauma of being uprooted from their homes, but also facing the very real threat of starvation, lack of medical care, limited access to clean water, all of it exacerbated by this conflict that just seems to drag on and on.
It's easy to get caught up in the political machinations of it all, but those details, those stalled talks, they have a real human cost. It sounds absolutely devastating for the people on the ground in Oromia.
It really is, and it highlights just how crucial finding a peaceful resolution is. But, as we've seen, it's incredibly difficult to achieve.
So where do we go from here? Is there any hope at all for lasting peace in Oromia?
Well, I always try to hold on to a little bit of optimism, and I think the fact that those high-ranking OLA commanders were present at the table in Tanzania, that offers a glimmer. At the very least, it suggests that dialogue, even if it's fragile, is possible.
Right, because just getting them to lay down their arms isn't enough, clearly. We've seen time and time again how these agreements, they can just fall apart if you don't address the underlying issues. So what would a real lasting peace, what would that even look like in Oromia?
It would have to be a fundamental shift, a real commitment to sharing power and resources in a way that simply hasn't happened before. Imagine a future where the Oromo people have a genuine voice, a real say in how their land is governed, how those resources are used, how their culture is protected and respected.
So it's about more than just like acknowledging their language and their heritage on paper.
Exactly. It has to be more than just symbolic gestures. It's about giving the Oromo people a true seat at the table, not just, a token presence. It means ensuring that they benefit from the wealth that their land holds, that their voices are heard when decisions are being made that impact their lives. And crucially, it's about confronting the injustices of the past, holding those responsible for violence, for oppression, accountable, so that true healing can actually begin.
Accountability, shared power, economic justice. I mean, these are not easy things to achieve. It really makes you realize just how deep these divides go.
They do.
Yeah.
But I think recognizing that, seeing the depth of the problem, that's the first step towards actually finding solutions. And who knows, maybe by doing this, by shedding some light on this conflict, by starting to understand the complexities and the human cost, maybe we can contribute in some small way to forging that path toward peace.
It's a path we all hope they find. This deep dive has certainly revealed a complex and honestly often heartbreaking reality in Oromia. We'll be continuing to follow this story closely, but as we wrap up this episode, we want to leave you with this. What resonated most with you from everything we've discussed, and what do you think those first steps, those crucial first steps towards a brighter future for Oromia, what could those look like? We'd love to hear your reflections.